So welcome everyone to this session titled Tools for Change, Mapping Media in Your Community. I'm really pleased to be here. My name is Tom Glaisyer. I'm a Knight Media Policy Fellow at the New America Foundation. We're going to try and keep this pretty lively and have plenty of discussion, I hope, as well as sort of Q&A after the short presentations from myself and my co-panelists. We've got some handouts here, some of which are examples of mapping, some of which is describing a part of a tool that's going to be demonstrated, and also a toolkit that might be useful to you. I've got to say I'm really pleased. You organise sessions and you never know how many people, if anyone will show up and how many, and I'm really pleased that we've got a good turnout here. So this media mapping effort that a number of us have been undertaking has been driven partly by this 2009 report funded by the Knight Foundation and executed by the Knight Commission. They came up with 3 headings for recommendations, and it really drove my work in DC to say, well, okay, if we're going to make recommendations and elaborate them for policymakers, we need to know what's going on the ground in local areas. So when we go to the FCC, we can say, okay, they say, well, there's no problem. We say, well, there might not be a problem somewhere, but there is a problem in Scranton or in Seattle or in North Carolina, and this is what it is, and this is the policy recommendation you should adopt to make things better. Now, this was focused very much on policymakers, but as we've gone through it and as we've got to know each other with our different approaches, we've sort of really got very interested in this as a tool for local individuals at a local level and groups at a local level. And what I'm hoping comes out of this is something that some knowledge and skills and questions that you've got to allow you to understand, to explore the information health of your communities and bring people together, get discussions going, and really practically ground changes in your local media ecosystems with an understanding of what is the status quo. And you'll hear some of the stories about how this has come together for us. My co-panelists will talk about strategies, approaches, and tools that they've used. And I know there are people, or I heard there were people in the audience who have done some of this in Washington State. I'm not sure if the guys...
I don't see him.
Don't see him? He's not here yet. But I'm sure many of you have done, explored these ideas, similar ideas yourselves, and we'd love to have some dialogue. We will have some short presentations, and then a sort of two-way Q&A and working discussion, I hope. Speakers today, we have Professor C.W. Anderson from CUNY Staten Island. He did his PhD on looking at Philadelphia. Jessica Durkin will talk a lot about some more about Scranton and Seattle. Michelle McLellan really has been looking at this from a sort of production entity perspective, and I think is a different take on this in a really useful way. Fiona has been doing a lot of work in North Carolina and really trying to take her findings and make changes happen. And Rob has been slaving away over the last 3 months with this presentation in mind and this opportunity to share a tool that really does provide a lot of data for you. And it's in beta. It's really, this is the first time it's seeing the light of day, but welcome your usage of the data and critique and feedback on how it can develop further. So with that said, I will now pass the clicker to CW.
My research has been primarily based in Philadelphia. This was the work I did sort of mapping and thinking about the media ecosystem in Philadelphia as part of a very long, almost 6-year project of mine to kind of understand how journalism in sort of a major metropolitan area is changing because of the internet, because of new voices that are sort of entering the journalistic space, and with sort of the collapse of business models. So I'm primarily going to be talking about Philadelphia today, but I think the ideas I'm going to be talking about can be sort of appropriated by anyone, anywhere. And I'm going to really be providing sort of history and sort of big ideas here before we get into some of the more nitty-gritty, kind of more practically useful things. So this is to frame it, right? To frame the general discussion. Who here, while they've been at this conference, has heard the word ecosystem said by anyone on anywhere. Okay, this is this new buzzword, right? Media ecosystem. What does that, what does media ecosystem mean? When we talk about, aren't ecosystems in ponds, right? And in forests, and don't they involve, microbes and lizards and deciduous trees and everything? So what's an ecosystem, and what does it mean in relation to media? Our news has always been inside an ecosystem. We have always operated in a news ecosystem throughout the entire history of news. The end of the 19th century, there were over 20 daily newspapers in New York City alone. Think about that, 20 daily papers in one city. And in Pennsylvania and in eastern Pennsylvania, including Philadelphia, there were more than 60 ethnic newspapers at the end of the 19th century. So we have always had, historically, many, many media outlets everywhere that have all been working with each other and sort of collaborating, not collaborating, reading each other, talking to each other, having different people read them who then talk to themselves and to each other. That has always been the media world in which we've lived, not just historically, but even in modern times. You can see here just sort of 3 media outlets in Philadelphia. You've got the Philadelphia Tribune. That's the oldest African-American newspaper in Philadelphia. You've got something called the Defenestrator, which is an anarchist newspaper in Philadelphia. Their slogan is "A world without cops or bosses." And then you've got this other very famous sort of pirate radio station in Philadelphia, 91.3 Radio Mutiny. If you know anything about Prometheus Radio, that was the original radio station a lot of those folks worked on. So the point here is that we have always lived in a journalistic world where there have been tons of people producing publicly relevant information. Always. This has always been true. It was true in the 19th century, it was true in the 20th century, it was true in the 17th century. But this is what we thought the media world we lived in looked like. We had most of that diverse world of newspapers that we talked about at the end of the 19th century became, in most cities, a world where there was one newspaper. Only one, right? Where there were 1 or 2 news radio stations. And where there were sort of local news broadcasts that had, 2 minutes of real news a night, right? Followed by a lot of weather and sports. So for most of the time, for all of the time that any of us have been alive, and the world that, because it was all we knew, the world that we thought was the way things always were, was a world where you can see here where the primary journalistic organizations in local communities were daily newspapers, usually of which there was only one, right? And those newspapers would report the real serious news, right? They were the most important journalistic outlets in a community. Occasionally you would have local TV and they would report on car accidents, and sort of fires and, kind of violent random crime. And then radios would do some journalism as well. And all of that sort of fed into all of you, right? The public. All of you consumed that news in some fashion or other, and usually you went out and you occasionally talked about it with your friends or your family, right? You would read the paper and you'd go to a coffee shop and you'd talk about it with a friend. So you all talked. Then the internet came along. Now, the internet didn't necessarily change the way things were, right? This is really important. What the internet did was the internet allowed everything that had always been happening to suddenly become visible to everyone, right? All of a sudden, the Defenestrator and the Philadelphia Tribune and all of these little newspapers and all of you talking, all of a sudden that was online. And it was all just sort of out there, right? And there's a fancy academic term for what was going on, and the word is inscription, right? It's a fancy term, but if you all think of what an inscription means, it means making something materially present, right? It's inscribed, it's there, you can see it. And so, rather than this, our online world looks something like this. This is a network map of the local online media ecosystem in Philadelphia, and it should look very complex and confusing to you. It should be you should be sitting there thinking, what the heck is that? What does that all mean? I'm not going to, for lack of, for time purposes, I'm not going to get into what it actually says, but if you look at the news outlets online, they can look like this, or they can even look like this. These are all the digital websites dealing with news and communication in Philadelphia. Maps, right? And the other panelists are going to talk about how these maps work. So this is basically just a brief history. I want to conclude with some caveats. So, before we get too excited by these little bubble graphs, oh, this is very impressive, this looks very interesting. Just a couple caveats. Caveat one, digital mapping of the kind I showed you here only captures a small slice of the media ecosystem. It captures the things that are online. So if you're not online, it doesn't show up in this kind of map, right? So that's one caveat. Second caveat is much digital mapping fails to capture the power dynamics in these ecosystems, right? It still doesn't tell you what's important, who has the power, who doesn't have the power. That is not captured in these maps. But mapping your media ecosystem can be a powerful visual tool for media justice advocates. It can be a good start. So with that sort of background and historical understanding, I would like to turn the mic over to Jessica. Right? Yes.
Hi, I'm Jessica Durkin. I live in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I'm going to show you some maps generated by some reports that I did last year with the New America Foundation. I co-wrote a Scranton case study and a Seattle case study, and comparing the two is very significant because, even though they're very different areas of the country, by mapping their systems and their media systems, it really tells a story of what is available and not, and what people are doing on the ground with respect to whatever city. So let me see here. Okay, this is Scranton, and here's one way of looking at it using Google Earth. We took a look at Scranton's media landscape, and those balloons there shows traditional media, and that's the Lackawanna Valley. I actually arbitrarily chose the boundaries of Lackawanna County. Now, having said that, Scranton's part of the Scranton-Wilkes-Barre market, so like our local television station, one of our network affiliates is based in Wilkes-Barre, but that actually serves like 22 counties in the whole area. But so they're included in this study, but to keep it simple, I mostly looked at the media within Lackawanna County. So I chose a geographic boundary, and that was arbitrary. And so that's what we came up with Scranton, and it's all very traditional media at this point. It's your newspapers, it's a couple of weeklies, it's some television and radio, but and population of the Lackawanna County is about 400,000. So that is the Scranton area. Okay, Seattle. Now this is a map taken from. It's actually a really ambitious project, and it's just unveiled this year, and it's called the Online Mapping Guide, Online Media Guide, with the Washington News Council, and Jacob Caggiano, who just walked in. He actually created this map, and he worked on this for a year. And I just interviewed Jacob for a blog post recently. And so this Washington News Council, they essentially tracked down every single media outlet they could find, and they're at about 1,000. Okay, now I zoomed in because this goes right down to the neighborhood level, and that's actually like a snapshot of Seattle. And those yellow dots or yellow balloons are hyperlocal sites, new digital media just within that, I would say maybe 10-mile radius or 10 square miles of Seattle City. So I'm just trying to find to show different ways of visualizing where media is, and you can look at it from the local standpoint or statewide. And this is another example going to England. This person he's an API sort of a technologist wizard is gathering he's trying to gather every hyperlocal site in the UK, and that's the map this is the visuals he's chosen for it and he's used. And I think he's got about 467 right now. I'm sorry. Yeah, with some of the mapping that I've done a bit of mapping, and usually it's trying to locate where the publication is exactly. Yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah, we do. We try to do research on where this person blogs from or has their newsroom or whatever. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, and so again, that's the UK. The large red cluster is like 100 and something representing around London. Obviously, your population centers are going to be. You can usually have more startups in those larger population centers, but it gives you an idea of where people are doing news and making news around the country. Okay, this is another example of a map, and this is a citizen journalism map by the Knight Center, and they've got people can add themselves to it, but this sort of shows you how people are looking at citizen journalism sites, so you can measure it in a lot of different ways. And just while we're on the while we're looking at diagrams, this is from Journalism That Matters, and they mapped, quote unquote, the new news ecosystem from the actual standpoint of the reporter and operations on the ground. This is from 2008, and it was sort of envisioned the future of news gathering, and they created a map for that. So, and then the relationship of information and editors and reporters and bloggers and how the information is found and disseminated. So that's one way to visualize that granular activity. All right.
Great, thanks.
That's it. Thank you.
Jessica. Now we'll hear from Michelle McLellan.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about different types of local news sites that we're seeing. We talk a lot about hyper-local. I've kind of come to feel like that's one of the more meaningless terms in the vernacular. I came to this a couple of years ago. I started working with community news startups and getting to know quite a bit about their challenges and some of their successes. And at the same time, I started looking at national research that was being done about evaluating many of these sites. And the basic finding, I'm very much oversimplifying here, was that 90% of these sites are just not good. They're just not any good. They'll never replace newspapers. This is horrible. Oh, woe is us. And I push back at that a little bit. I come out of newspapers, but at the same time, I started looking at the research, and I really felt like it was saying they're not any good because they don't look like newspapers. They don't look like what we're used to seeing. So I decided not to really dispute that number, but to say, great, I'm going to go look for the 10% that are good and try to see what they can tell us about what's working and try to figure out how we could help them work even better in support of a more healthy local news ecosystem. And in the process of that, that's a different presentation. In the process of that, what I started seeing were some broad categories of types of sites. And I want to run through a few of them today. The reason I think these types are important to know about is that if you are going to be mapping your community, or if you're trying to work in the community space, it's really important to understand the role that a given site might play. Not only what it can do, but what the limits might be. And I think it's especially important to understand that these different types of sites are going to tend to have different models for sustainability. So it's not going to be all one way of getting funding. So I want to run through my site types very quickly. One is what I call the new traditional. And these are sites that have professional staffs. They have multi-million-dollar budgets. They tend to be doing a lot of investigative work. Increasingly, they're opening up. They're becoming state house watchdog operations. They're heavily grant funded now. They're nonprofits, but they've got to find other sustainability models, so they're acting more and more business-like. A lot of them are looking at corporate sponsorships. Some are looking at membership models like NPR. Examples of those, the Texas Tribune, MinPost, Voice of San Diego, are all part of the new traditional. And that's the Texas Tribune, which is a very good state government site. If you're interested in that type of coverage, I definitely recommend you look at them. The next category, and this is kind of my personal favorite, is what I call the community sites. And these often have professionals involved as well as volunteers. What distinguishes them is that they put community building right up there as a priority, right alongside doing news and information in journalism. They come in all shapes and sizes, different budgets. The example I have there, the St. Louis Beacon, is a multi-million-dollar site. Most of the sites operate more on a bootstrap budget, a lot smaller amounts of money. Oakland Local is another great example of a site that operates on far less money. They're also attracting startup grants, but they've got to find a sustainability model. Some of that goes more back to their role in capacity building. So they're training Oakland Local, for example, and Susan's here, the founder, could talk about this. They're training local nonprofits on how to use the web and how to use social media. So that's one of the ways they're doing community building. The next type of site in my sort of categorization is the micro-local site. And these are probably what people are mostly talking about with hyperlocal. These are very granular news, neighborhoods, small community sites. The budgets right now of the ones that are doing the best are over $100,000 a year. They're starting to hire part-time people. And they actually are finding a pretty strong revenue model in advertising. I'm not sure that advertising alone is going to carry them, but I think that, you know, there actually is a business model there for them, depending on the community, et cetera. The Batavian, which is up there, is a good example of a site that's making about $150,000 a year, 2 years in. So it's supporting the publisher and his family, and they're hiring part-timers. Other types I'm going to run through really quickly. Niche sites can be anything from, you know, environmental green sites to arts and entertainment sites. Aggregators, I want to make kind of a shout out to the local aggregators. I know that we some of us pay probably too much attention to, you know, what Bill Keller of the New York Times thinks about the Huffington Post, and certainly traditional media does not like aggregators, and possibly with good reason, because they have always been the focus of attention. And now the aggregators are sharing the space, sharing other links more widely. In the local space, aggregators can be extremely significant for these new startups, because how else are they going to get the exposure? Rich Gordon at Medill did a study last year of linkages across sites in Chicago and looked at about 300 sites and did sort of a heat map of who was sending traffic around to and fro and level of intensity. And the least intensity was the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times. The most intensity were a couple of little bootstrap aggregators, the Windy Citizen, which is what I have up there on the slide, and another one called Gaper's Block. And, you know, they're like, you know, pushing the blood through the veins. And so I really want to encourage you when you hear about the evil aggregators to really take a look at what's actually happening, because there are some aggregators who cheat. But a lot of them are really important to the ecosystem. A new category that's coming on are the student-powered sites. We're seeing more and more journalism schools start sites, not to be the student newspaper online, but to actually cover communities, to be micro-local sites. So I think they're going to become, in some communities, more and more significant players. The news systems, I think you're familiar with Patch. Everybody know about Patch. These are large companies that create a fairly low-cost model for a community online news site and then roll it out across many, many communities. I think Patch is up to about 900 now. And in some communities, this is a good thing, because this is better than what they had. In other communities, they're a threat to the local independent startup. And nobody's really sure how that's going to play out. So that's kind of my categories. I want to talk, since this is a session on mapping, I want to talk about a couple of efforts that I was not involved in, but I think show some promise. I think a lot of the mapping that we do focuses heavily on the institutions that are creating information. And I think that's very important to do. But I really like a couple efforts, Chicago Community News Matters and the Community Information Toolkit, because they focus on what information people are getting. and how accessible that information is to them. Chicago Community News Matters was an effort by the Chicago Community Trust that basically a survey of residents that helped them identify information gaps so that they could fund to those particular gaps. So, what they found were information deserts, as you might expect in low-income communities. So they're funding news coverage about and for those communities. The Community Information Toolkit takes that idea even farther in a way that I think is extremely promising. And it's basically a process that anybody can use to assess how hard or how easy it is to get important information in the community. It includes a scavenger hunt, for example. So, you can go find out, if you choose to look at employment, how hard is it to figure out how to find a job, as an example. And we have copies of that. I think most of you got some of those. But I would really, if you're interested in mapping your community, I would really encourage you to take a look at that. It was done by the Knight Foundation. The version that I brought with me is a 1.0. They're looking for feedback and comments on that to make it even better.
So I turn to Fiona, who's done some similar.
Hi, thanks for coming. And I'm Fiona Morgan, and I'm a graduate student in public policy at Duke. And before that, I was a reporter for the alternative news weekly in the Triangle area of North Carolina called the Independent Weekly. I was really proud to work there for 6.5 years, and I wrote a lot about media and technology. And so a lot of, when I wrote this case study, was sort of informed by that. Tom and I worked with Tom on this project, and we had in mind kind of two sets of audiences for it. So if you are thinking about doing something like this, or you have done it, he had in mind federal policymakers, and I really had in mind people at the local level that I knew who were doing media, and some of that meant that they were media organizations, and some of it meant that they were people who might potentially fund organizations or do or should think about it. And also was trying to sort of get people who may not think of themselves as being part of this space to be part of it. So what I was looking for in the Triangle was what kind of investments people made. If I was looking at a news outlet, how many reporters do they have? How many editions do they put out with the same stuff in it? Where are these newspapers? You were talking about information deserts. Who owns them, and how do they think about what they do? And one of the things that I think was really useful in doing it is that I talked to people. I did a lot of interviews, and so if I kind of thought that I knew something, I would definitely pick up the phone, and I really thought that was very important because not only is it good in terms of getting the right information, but it actually kind of helps builds conversations, relationships with stakeholders in the process of just simply, before you even put the report out. So I would really encourage, if you're going to do something like this, don't just rely on what's published or what you can get online, but really pick up the phone. It's a good thing to do. I also we versioned it. So we did a 1.0, and we did this on purpose, and we didn't have any policy recommendations in the first report, and that was on purpose as well. I'm not a real big fan of someone parachuting into a community and spending a little time there and talking to a few people that somebody said they should talk to, and then, deciding what these people should do. So what I wanted to do was really try to listen and have the recommendations flow out of that conversation. And so we did version 1.0, and this is going to be a story about the engagement that we did in the Triangle once we had released that. And I think it will tell you sort of, this is not a literal map, but it's kind of like a social network, I feel like. So the first thing that we did, the report came out in September of 2010, and a couple people blogged about it, had some interest on Twitter and places like that. But we convened a meeting in October at the Triangle Community Foundation, and I had interviewed folks from the Triangle Community Foundation, asked them about whether they funded media. They sort of didn't, but they were interested, and they were interested in what I was doing. And the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy at Duke, which is where I'm in school, also co-hosted this. And so we had a really interesting group of people at that meeting. Some of them were people I'd interviewed for the case study, and some of them were people I'd never talked to before. And the best part was that a lot of them had never really talked to each other. We had the executive editor of the News and Observer, which is our main daily newspaper, Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper, that has literally had its newsroom cut more than half in the past 5 years because it's owned by McClatchy, and McClatchy has been making these massive layoffs. And the manager of the local NPR station, WNC, and we had a couple bloggers, a publisher of a Spanish language paper. We had journalism professors. We had a guy who started a local newspaper, a retired cop with no journalism background. I mean, it was great. And we had all these people together. And it also had some people that were not, didn't really think of themselves as being part of the media, like the CIO of the city of Raleigh. She does a lot of, she got a BTOP grant, a broadband grant to do technology access. I don't know that the NNO would think of her as being in the media, and so I wanted to make sure that those people sat at the same table and thought about the same concepts. One of the people that was in the room was a guy named Ryan Thornburg, who's a professor at journalism at UNC in Chapel Hill. And he did such a great thing for us, which is that he blogged about the meeting and the report, and he said nice things about it, but what was even better was that he articulated the findings much better than I had done, which was very helpful. And just some of the things that he said was, the Triangle doesn't necessarily need more professional journalists. What it needs, and I'm not sure I quite agree with that, but what it needs is more people who think journalistically. We need more people who can not just describe what is seen, but who are curious about what we might be seeing. And he had a sort of rough set of policy recommendations in this blog post that ended up forming the basis of ours, work with him on that. Some were targeted at media organizations. He said professional reporters whose ranks are being mowed down by an unsustainable business model that relies on corralling an increasingly dispersed and disaggregated audience need to organize their audience in order to lower the costs of reporting. And to the public, to sort of think of this as a civic issue, he said, in our current Darwinian media landscape, the creature most likely to become extinct is a free, fair, and factual public discourse that holds people, powerful people accountable, shines light in dark places, and gives voice to the voiceless. So, and again, the idea of discourse is a little broader than just media, right? It's about the conversation, whether people can engage with the information. So then Ryan and Damon Circosta, who is an executive director of an organization called the NC Center for Voter Education in Raleigh, and they really did a lot of stuff on campaign finance reform in North Carolina. And now they're trying to get more into the space of figuring out what sort of information needs we have, because just like states all over the country, our state house reporting is, again, it's like tumbleweeds in the press room at the legislature. And it's not just coverage of the state government, it's also just because is anyone really reporting on policy issues at the state level? So he convened a meeting the following month, and we were able to present a little bit about this report there, and also, help him figure out who should be in the room. So it was like expanding the scope, and it was good because when those people got there, and about half of them had been at our meeting, they already had a context to talk about an ecosystem. It was great. Then in February, so this is part of how engagement can be a really slow process. It can be a very slow churn, right? So the NNO's executive editor, John Drescher, like I said, he was at our meeting in October, and the report sat unread on his desk for about 4 months or so, which I completely understand. I mean, a lot of things are on my desk too.
It is 76 pages.
It is 76
long.
pages, yeah. Right. So, and I don't necessarily advise doing that long a report because there's sort of an inverse relationship between the number of pages and the likelihood people are going to read it. But in any case, he eventually did read it when he was writing his column. And he called me up and he said, I'm going to write a column about this, and I'd like to interview you. And so what do you think would be interesting in this behemoth that you handed me? What is a good story I can pull out for a newspaper column? And I said, well, do you remember that guy that was in the room with you, who was a community organizer and a techie and a blogger? And do you remember how his community group had put one of their meetings online, and it was a meeting with a public official. And because that was online, one of your reporters was able to access the record of the meeting and then write a story about it. I think you should talk about him, because that's an input to what you do. And I say inputs. I use this like goofy econ term, but what Ryan says is a tributary to the mainstream. That it's not just that the mainstream flows down on us; it's that we can put things into it to make it better. And so he did tell, and the funny side note to that is that I didn't realize this, but Mark Turner on his personal blog really rips on Drescher all the time. He actually had a post called "John Drescher is an Idiot," which I did not know until after his column came out, and John emailed me and he said, "Oh." And I said, "I promise I didn't know." He's like, "That's fine, I don't care, as long as he's reading the paper." So version 2.0 has now with policy recommendations. And it's great because I feel very good about the fact that those came from a serious conversation that we had where we really listened to what people had to say. We sort of used Ryan's was a starting point, and we talked to people, and we already have buy-in. Before the thing is even published, you have people who understand what it is, they support it, they feel invested in it. And another great thing about versioning is that at that meeting, one of the things that came up was someone who should have been in the room but wasn't, who I had not interviewed yet, a guy who was a general manager of a broadcast station in Durham and had done this hyper-local online experiment. And it was successful in the sense that people liked it, but it was not successful in the sense that it got cut by Media General that owned the station. So he ended up leaving, and he bought a local AM progressive talk radio station and is doing hyper-local on the radio. And he had read the report, and I called him to interview him for version 2.0. And before that even was published, his station invited me to come. They have this day that they do every year where they have a whole day as a community forum. It's great. One of the hours that they're going to spend of that day is going to be related to local media ecology. So the concept, right? It's a slow churn, but it really pays off. Okay, thanks very much.
Hi, Rob McCausland, and Community Media Database.org, Community Media Database 1.0, is a pilot project funded for a 3-month stint. We have 1 month left by the Benton Foundation, and we've been working with the support of the New America Foundation Media Policy Initiative, as well as Prometheus Radio Project. It is a free, collaboratively developed online reference tool containing contact and other information of all types of community media providers. Currently, the feature set of this tool, and that's what the site looks like, those orange dots, that's LPFM stations in the country. There's about 150 of those. The feature set of this tool, there are Google Doc directories of 3 types of community media. There's a CiviCRM database for each of them, and there are Google Maps via a tool that's been built by the National Center for Media Engagement. That's the feature set. The data sets that each of those features are applied to, it started out with, and you'll see slides that mostly concentrate on community access television providers. However, the second data set that we included was low power FM radio stations. Then we have moved on to include information about 3,800 full power FM radio stations and about 385 non-commercial television stations. Going back to the feature set for a second, the Google Maps does not allow, at this point, the NCME Google Maps. I won't be focusing too much on it. It's not really participatory, but I do want to draw your attention to these other 2 tools, the Google Docs and the CiviCRM, which in fact are participatory. This is in your handout as well. This is a screenshot of the Illinois section of the Google Docs spreadsheet for community access television providers. Off to the right are columns that you can't see for contact information. I believe this has Facebook and Twitter pages. Before I go any further, I just want to take a step back and let you know, what's the source of this data? Where did this come from? Well, back in 2000, I started a website that had a list of access providers when I was cablecast manager at Boston Neighborhood Network. And that's something that I maintained over the years, and I guess somebody thought it was useful. They took it almost word for word and put it on Wikipedia. So if you go to Wikipedia's list of PEG access centers, you will find the progenitor of this. It was back in last April when Ellen Goodman asked a panel at the Future of Media, do we even need PEG anymore? And that's what kind of spurred me to take the list that I had and do everything I could to find, well, just how many of them are there? It's not an easy question, and we're not going to get into the weeds on that, but one thing led to another, and last December I wrote a blog for the Media Policy Initiative, which looked at the largest 276 cities in the U.S., those that are over 100,000 in population. And I'm here to tell you, folks, that 93% of them, 254 of them, have their government meetings on cable television. You get rid of PEG access TV, you get rid of at least access television, and you get a mighty big hole to fill. Now, on this sheet, there are, as I say, contact information, title, name, title, email address. It does not include email address unless I got permission in emailing these folks to put it on there. It's a Google Doc. You can edit it yourself. So I'm sending out edit invites to this, and people are using it and updating it. We could go on and on and on and add data fields onto this, but it would get kind of unwieldy, crawl off to the right. Hence the need for a database. I assume that most of you know this, what a CiviCRM database is, an open source platform. This is a picture of the search form for PEG access. There are obviously the standard files that ship with a database, the contact information for organizations, but there are also the some essential custom fields, the population size, the number of channels, do they do government meeting coverage. Again, you could go on and create all sorts of custom data fields that access providers would find useful, and we do hope to do that. But initially, this is about all that we dared to ask for. You can go to the site, you can go to that form, you can click submit without clicking any of the filters, and you will see a result that looks something like this. This is the multi-results screen. There's actually about 4 different versions of this you can get. This is the contact one. There's one for programming. There's one for system information. And off to the right, you see a blue word for each that says view. Click on that, you get the data sheet for each individual access provider. Click on map, and you can map any individual one of them, or at the top left, you can map all of these contacts. And there are all of the, in that database, 1,845 PEG access centers. Just a couple more examples of that. There's all of the ones in Massachusetts. There's all of the ones in Illinois. There's all of the ones in California. Excuse me, I say all of the ones that we've been able to locate, because PEG access is a little hard to get data on because it's a result of local negotiations between the franchise authority, and there's no federal or any place you can go that says, show me all of these access centers. There's a closer of the Bay Area. Here's an example of that data set uploaded into the National Center for Media Engagement's tool, which allows you to upload in CSV format different data sets and mash them together. The different colors here represent the different management types of PEG access providers. One is those that are managed by government entities, those that are managed by nonprofits, those that are managed by higher ed or ed. There are Google Doc sheets for other media. This one is for the low power FM. I should say that although I have written to all of the PEG providers and given them login information so they can go in and update their own information on the CiviCRM database, I have not yet done that for the LPFMs, but Prometheus Radio Project is working with us and they are sending out a survey, so we hope to fill in that survey as well as this Google Doc spreadsheet. There is a Google Doc spreadsheet for full power FMs, and I didn't break the tool yet. There's about 4,000 rows. Actually, I've got one combined with the 800 of the LPFM, and it still performs. I don't know how big you can make these things, but keep on keeping on, Google. And that is the non-commercial television. About 335, 345 are PBS affiliates. There's about another 40 that are not PBS affiliates. Before I conclude with this portion of the talk, which is the slideshow, let me just say that in your handout is a picture of what it looks like if an access provider fills out the data sheet entirely. Jen Gilliman, the director of Commons TV in San Francisco, did a wonderful job, went in and filled it out, so you can see what all the custom data fields look like when somebody actually uses the tool. What we see here is a mashup, again using the NCME tool, this time looking at the state of Illinois, journalism schools, programs from higher ed institutions combined with community media outlets in that community. Just winding up, there are potential users for this kind of data. Obviously, the community media providers themselves, there are at least 3 reasons why a community media provider might want to have good data in here so that they could use. For advocacy reasons, the low power, the non-commercial, the Community Radio Act is going to need some advocacy work in terms of getting it implemented, and PEG access advocates are going to need some help getting the Community Access Preservation Act introduced and passed in Congress. This is one tool that should help that advocacy. Community organizers and national message distributors should also be able to find a tool like this useful for a variety of reasons, not the least of which would be of the users would be researchers of such things as local media ecologies and the interrelated impacts of content streams and their uses. So those are some of the users that we hope, and uses that we hope will want to keep this thing alive after its pilot funding ends in 1 month. For version 2, we're looking for some broader participation, journalism program, media outlets, community newspapers, media arts centers, community technology centers, place blogs, many that you've seen in the demonstrations earlier. We're looking for deeper participation, more data on programming, operations, facilities, budgets, policies. All of this, if people would put it in, we would be able to gather and make some sweeping ideas about the state of community media. We're looking for shape-based maps as well as point-based to address the question that was made earlier about where are you actually mapping these from. Let me tell you that LPFM and FM data that comes from the FCC, that may be a mailing address for the licensee, but it may not be where the transmitter is actually located. So we need better data on that. Finally, we'd like to be able to overlay non-media data types on the media layers, like congressional districts, demographics. The mind boggles. Lastly, we promised we would draw your attention to this in this presentation. I just put it up on the website's blog today. Yesterday, you may have missed the news that the Benton Foundation released a report that they had funded for the Alliance for Community Democracy on the harms that have happened to PEG access providers, PEG access TV, in the last 5 years due to state regulation changes and business practices. In that study, which was conducted by the Buskey Group, they list 100 access centers that have closed around the country, and more that are most likely on the chopping block due to these legislative disasters. So I linked to the ACD's report on our blog, communitymediadatabase.org, and I commend it to your attention. And thank you all.
Thank you, Rob. So you've had a sort of whirlwind tour of several sort of person years worth of work here in 45 minutes. The whole idea behind this is that these are tools for change, and what we've discussed are some approaches. The ultra-methodical 76-page report with 405 footnotes, courtesy of Fiona. Some slightly slimmer reports, but followed up with by Jessica in Scranton and Seattle. And then this data set that Rob is just really launching. Now, I'm aware in the room we've got Ben Sheldon, who was actually one of the inspirations for some of this mapping of Rob's, and others in the room who might be interested in this. So I'm going to open up to questions right now. I've got a couple myself, but I'll hold them because I want to sort of get a dialogue going about really is this useful? Can you see uses for you of these tools, and if you see challenges with doing this sort of work, what were those challenges? And perhaps we can share some insights from the work we've done. But any questions welcome, but I just thought kick things off in that direction. So the gentleman there, and I'm going to be the mic person.
Yeah, my name is Tom, and I'm with a community radio station in Kansas City, Missouri. I host a weekly public affairs show. I'm also involved with a media reform group that is kind of moribund and struggling. We've gotten some new life because we're hosting the Grassroots Radio Conference this August in Kansas City, and that's brought some people in, but we've had a lot of trouble keeping the group going. This session was highly recommended to me by a couple of Free Press staffers. In light of my talking to them about I want to find ways to keep some kind of organization continuing on and growing and not just have an event this summer, but have some ongoing participation in the community for media reform. And I sort of suspect there's something here that should resonate with me, and I just don't get it yet. But what does all these little map dots help me in doing that, or does it?
Say, Fiona, do you want to take that and explore some of the changes that you've...
Well, so I sort of think of it from a policy standpoint, and you're asking more about organizational sustainability. But from a policy standpoint, the mapping is really important, because when people make decisions, they use whatever information they've got. And you mentioned the state cable franchise and how that impacted PEG. Chad Johnston is here from the People's Channel, and from the People's Channel, and he was really actively involved in trying to get information to the legislature about that when they unfortunately passed that bill. And one of the problems was they didn't even know how many PEG stations there were. If this map had been available, I think it really what do you think, Chad?
Yeah, it would have been, it would have been immensely powerful to show that to legislators and the legislative folks and to network folks. My thought to you is that it's got to be people in your neck of the woods that may not be doing radio, but are doing similar local media things in terms of organizing and being sustainability. You got to build a big little media army, and there's bound to be in these mapping tools folks near you that are doing that.
So in the spirit of creating the two-way, there's a gentleman at the front who I think had some answers.
I'm terminology challenged. What does PEG station mean?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, good to call us on that. Thanks for calling me on that. PEG is public access education and government channels. So it's a sort of a carved out space in cable for channels that are for public use. A lot of them by governments to broadcast city council meetings, and sometimes public access stations for community people produce media. And so it's a form of public media if you define public media much more broadly than just what CPB funds.
So I want to just jump in on that question also. What are some of the reasons why you think you've had sustainability troubles?
Well, one is that we seem to have so many disparate little groups who, you know, coming out of the Madison Media Reform Conference in 2003, there's all this enthusiasm, and we start a little organization, and then everybody goes on their own little track with their own little cause, and you talk about whatever your cause is, make media reform number 2, and I sort of feel the same way now about move to amend, but and they nod their head and say they agree, and then they go off on their own disparate, unorganized little thing.
So, you know,
Scattershot.
right. A lot of those problems can't be solved through this stuff, but I've been in rooms where these types of, it's, you know, it's one thing if you're sitting here, you're watching this, you're like, well, I don't live in Scranton, I don't live in, you know, the Triangle, I don't live in Philadelphia, but, you know, when you are in a room where these visual presentations of the community that exists are displayed to the people who live in that area. So, you know, when you see that map of Kansas City, right, of everybody that's out there and how they all relate to each other, that creates a sense that we're all in it together, basically. It's not a substitution for organizing, it's not a substitution for the hard work, but it is a way of drawing everybody together to sort of feel like, hey, wait, we're all in this together, we are unified, right? Even though we're doing our disparate little things, you know, we are all in this Kansas City media ecosystem, and, you know, we better all work together to get this stuff changed. You know, and it's one thing for you to say that, hey, you guys, we're all in it together, but, you know, it's a little thing, but, you know, I've been in rooms where people have seen these maps and they've just said, whoa, wait a second, this is serious, you know, we're all this community. And, you know, so it's, you know, I think that this itself can be an organizing tool, I guess is what I would say. In addition to being a policy tool, it can be an organizing tool that you can add to your arsenal when you try to get people excited and get them all together in the same room.
I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but are there such maps already created for Kansas City? And if not,
We can download. Rob could give you it this afternoon.
Can I just? Okay, I actually just want to jump on real quick to what Chris was saying earlier, and to add a couple of caveats. And then I will not take a long time, I promise, and we can go to questions. Like Chris said, again, this is an organizing tool. It's not an end game. Don't, you know, like, for a while there, people were thinking, oh, media mapping is the ultimate way, that's like the answer to everything in, you know, future of media. It really isn't. It is a tool. It is not the final place that you want to be. The other thing is, it's only a snapshot. So it's pretty much outdated. As soon as you create a map, it's already, something will have changed. The minute that you mash up all your stuff together, something else will have either been born or died in your media ecosystem. So understand that it's constantly changing. It's labor intensive. Creating these maps takes a lot of manpower, a lot of effort, and some technical savvy. And the other thing is they're highly subjective. Which is a good thing, because this is a flexible space. But just bear in mind that they're subject to the person making them or the institution making them. So they can vary wildly depending on semantics and depending on, you know, the goal, what they want to see out of these, what they're looking for, how they're measuring the data. So just, you know, understand that these are evolving all the time. So that's all. I just wanted to add that.
So I'll just add, we had a meeting similar to in Scranton, Jessica and I, similar to the meetings that Fiona had in North Carolina. And when you have the representative of the senator in the room, the local publisher, the local councillors, the PEG station, the public TV, the libraries in the room, they haven't previously often got together. And when someone has the audacity to say in front of the publisher, reading your newspaper is like chewing day-old gum, you realize something, you know, it's difficult for him to ignore that and has him thinking, well, I think I need to change what's going on my website if this is what's happening. So there's a magic to using this stuff, but it's just a tool. Now I'm going to take this gentleman first because I saw him, and then yourself.
I've got, my name is Todd O'Neill. I'm from San Antonio, Texas, on the board of the Media Justice League there. We're going to be doing a mapping project, but we're more focused on access, internet access. So we're going to be mapping public internet and open Wi-Fi spots, but this has given me a whole other group of things to think about now.
You're welcome.
So two questions. One, from a local perspective, what would be a good geographic scope? San Antonio is not just San Antonio. If you say it's South Texas, I think that's larger than Connecticut and maybe Massachusetts combined. I mean, it's a lot of area. And then the other question is, what is, I don't know how to say this, what is news or what is community media? We have beer bloggers, food bloggers, tech bloggers. Are they part of that landscape?
Okay, I'm from Corpus Christi, so hi. And as far as South Texas, I think you'd be getting into, you may want to define your boundaries. This is my own opinion, because Corpus Christi is South Texas, and we're 2 hours south of San Antonio, and so is Brownsville, which is 3 hours south of Corpus Christi. So, and then, yeah, so but there's about 100 ways you can cut it. So if you want, we can talk later if you want, but I would just try to, maybe in your situation, check population or geographic boundaries, and that's arbitrary. But that at least will give you a starting point.
I was thinking about using we have a metropolitan planning organization that does infrastructure work, and I was thinking about limiting it to their boundaries.
Sure. Yeah, you can. Yeah, talk to them. Talk to the Chamber of Commerce. Talk to a lot of those civic groups, and you can kind of get an idea of where the boundaries will start to show themselves. I just chose, like, for Scranton area, I chose just Lackawanna County. I thought that's just easy, and so yeah. Anyway.
There's also another scoping aspect of this is. There's a logical size, and it sounds like the metropolitan makes sense, but then there's a time frame on which you want to be doing this. You want to scope a level of detail that you can achieve in an appropriate time so no one forgets about it. So maybe it's 2 or 3 months with the resources you have, and you issue a version 1.0, and then consider that as a starting point. It has enough facts, and it's accurate enough that you can bring people around the table. And sometimes it's useful for them to say, well, you got this slightly wrong, but so then you fix it, and then they buy into the version 2 more easily. So that's and Fiona, I think you had
You asked about what is news. That's such a good question, and how do you define that? So I had a framework that I used, which had to do with information for the economics of news, which is that there's like basically 4 types of information. There's consumer demand information, which is, I think I might buy a computer. What kind of computer should I get? There's entertainment demand, which is, videos of cats on YouTube, and there's, and most of actually the media that's produced. There's producer demand information, which is the kind of stuff that you subscribe to for your work, or, the reason that Congressional Quarterly, can charge a lot of money, those types of things. But it's the voter demand information. What would you need for media in democracy in order to be just an informed citizen? And that's the kind of stuff that there's a sort of natural market failure for, because whether or not someone reads it, it will still change policies or not that affect them financially. So it's hard to monetize. So I don't know if that's the framework that I used.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think I would look at defining what types of information or topics you think are most important for people to receive. And one way to do that would be to ask them as part of a survey or less formally. So you might end up in a place where, you want to focus on, what we call civic information, et cetera. You may be defining that very differently than what people feel they need. I mean, I mentioned the Chicago Community Trust survey. There's like a lot of political news in Chicago all the time. Well, the key finding of that survey was people don't feel they get any sense from their media of who to vote for. So I would think about topic focus rather than blogs or mainstream or whatever.
My name's Peter Miller. I'm here in Boston. I'm a fan of getting a sense of the ecosystem you're working with and of mapping it. I can tell you from the Boston caucus yesterday and from the media reform roundtable at the last session that is very exciting. People talking to one another about projects that each other didn't, that people didn't know about, and getting a sense of the range and diversity of them is something that's quite exciting to do when you're trying to build something. My question has to do with some of the features of the ecosystem that I didn't hear addressed, and I had some hopes about them at certain points and some questions about them to both the panelists and people in the audience. And one is I didn't hear either as a type or as a partner, a feeder in the North Carolina story, these local community network sites that are being built and are starting to explode, that a number of people held some great promise for in terms of both its capacity building for communities and its connectivity to local news. Stephen Cliff, for those of you who follow eDemocracy, has helped to gather a number of them together. There's one of the forums, it's called Locals online, and been following that and listening today, and I don't hear any mention of those local groups, and I'm struck, and I wondered if there's some disconnect, that there are some possibilities of building there. And then along with that, I look at the previous generation of community networks, which were much broader, and there were at least two generations of them, and that did have sort of like a news component to them at one point. And the free nets that started in the 80s and the early 90s, and then the next generation of community networks, which in fact had some of its national leadership in North Carolina, and I think of like Charlotte's Web as one example, and RTPNet as another example. And so my question to you, Fiona, was RTPNet ever at the table or a part of the sort of ecology of groups that came together? And I'd just be interested in hearing.
RTPNet was not part of our discussion, but broadband and network in community groups was. Unfortunately, a lot of what you're talking about, it's not, I don't think that there's a lot of community. So are you talking about broadband providers? Or are you talking about, I'm not, you might have to clarify for me so that I don't misspeak.
Are you familiar at all with RTPNet? It's research. It was the community network for many, many years. I think it's still in operation. It's sort of like a community information and training network for particularly literacy programs and community technology centers in the Raleigh-Durham Research Triangle Park area. And I think it still has a number of sort of like resources and forums and conversations about activities that go on.
I'm not sure. Maybe.
They still exist. Judy Hellman.
Oh, Judy Hellman. Yeah. Oh, okay.
That group is there.
No, unfortunately, Judy Hallman was not at the table, and she should have been. But I think you're right to call that out. There's a lot of interest in broadband and municipal broadband, but you may know there's a bill that's probably going to pass the legislature to ban it, and so that, again, it's not exactly what you're talking about, but there's not as much of that as I would like to see.
Michelle, I'm not sure if you've got a thought on that. I don't know Stephen Clift. I think there's a lot in the case studies we've done. We've actually done Minneapolis and Paul, so he features in that case study, and the sort of group that he's fostering clearly plays a role there. There are some clear news stories that came out of his eDemocracy Online local groups there, but across the other case studies, we didn't see those nearly as much as I thought we would. Much more came out of grounded community groups who are just beginning to get online, if that helps.
I'm a mapping junkie, so this is all very exciting to me. And as someone who's running a local site in a regional area, I would love to hear if beyond this panel there are any efforts going on for all of you to coordinate. One of the things I think is great about the local space is that people are not competing with each other, and I've learned so much from people working in other areas of the country that I think that for people who are trying to be a part of this, being able to share knowledge not only in their region but across regions is really important. Is there an established hashtag? Is there any meta collection of data that you're going to aggregate anywhere? I would love to see something come out of this where even just you guys were pooling a way to access this data on a page so that it would be much more discoverable in terms of search engines.
So someone may jump in the audience that knows of that thing that's going on, but you know, from what I know about it, that's sort of the next frontier. You know, there's what needs to be done, and what's great about Michelle's way of thinking about this is that you're getting to generalizable categories, right? You're getting to okay, Minneapolis is this way, Seattle's this way, Scranton is this way, the Research Triangle is this way. Okay, we sort of bring all these together. We say, all right, these are the local things that we're discussing. What can we take out of that is generalizable in a way that we can understand a larger sense of what's going on in media in a local community level? To the best of my knowledge, we are still at the local mapping phase, but the next, and I know that probably 10 people now are going to be like, but I'm doing me. No, so that's great. But from what I know, we are really still at the local building stage.
I'll just try and answer that a little bit. Susan, the effort that Rob's doing is really our play across providing a national resource, but the curation, all the stuff, the work that Jessica, Fiona, and I have done on mediapolicy.newamerica.net, and we have a hashtag MPINAF that we tweet around these questions.
Okay, actually, I also want to make sure we give at least a couple of minutes to Jacob, who is in the audience over there, who created the Washington map. But just at some point,
where is Jacob? Right. Okay. So this.
Okay, he can speak to the difficulty. That's his methodology.
I'm a mapping junkie too, so I love this stuff, and I think it's a great discovery tool. But I want to sort of take Jessica's comment about this being a snapshot, and point out that it's sort of less useful now than it was when this presentation started because of entropy. And my question back to the panel, okay, maybe my time granularity is wrong, right. I mean, I'll turn it around to the panel. I mean, how do you take this from being a snapshot and turn it into an ongoing, sustainable process?
Hire people to do it.
I don't think you necessarily have to.
Well, actually, you know what? I think Jacob can also answer that because they're doing open source.
So we have a couple of things we have done, and I'll pass on to Jacob. We have uploaded a lot of what we've done onto Wikipedia, so it's actually useful in an open space like that. And we are actively sharing it and trying to allow other people to update it on the internal wiki platform that we have. But that's only a partial answer.
Hey, I'm Jacob. Hi. I started the OMG. That's the online media guide. That's our little acronym for Seattle and Washington State. And we're trying to tackle this. And the good news is that it's not that hard to make one of these maps. I did it in Google. All I did was make a Google Doc, and you feed it through now, and it turns into a map. You tell it what you want the pin to look like. And that's about it. The hard part is the maintenance, and that's what everyone's figuring out, right? And that's a snapshot of the one, and the things in the water are the ones where I didn't have the address. So they get to swim. And there's tons of pins behind it, but you can't. Anyways.
Did you map zip code or lat long?
Well, we geocoded, if we had the zip code, and see, it was just a pain for me to try and get everyone's address, so I kind of found it and put it through. So this is actually very rough, but Google's able to geocode it by neighborhood. So like I put Beacon Hill, or I put ballot or whatever, and it gave the neighborhood. Now, someone had made a good point that it doesn't have regional coverage, which is the next step, is to have, you know, polygons and you know, areas. I've been experimenting. I want to experiment with Open Heat Map, which does heat maps, and if you can assign a value, then you can have colors that look like thermal. Anyways, I guess I want to address first the maintenance issue, and that's what we're trying to tackle. And so the problem is that we're the I'll just stand up, I guess. Hi. The Washington News Council started this. The News Council has kind of a different mission, and it's based on a traditional News Council idea of promoting transparency, accountability, integrity, and things like that in news media. But we sort of took on this project. We got a little bit of grant money to do it. So I started doing it, and I built the spreadsheet, and eventually it grew and grew and grew. So anyways, the maintenance issue is the challenge. And so what we want to do is, it's sort of the chicken and the egg idea. And so basically, you have to crowdsource it. I mean, there's no other way to do it. You can't have people, you know, even if you have interns that work on slave wages or whatever, you cannot keep up with it. So you have to get people to want to enter, and you're going to have a drop-off immediately from doing that. But like I said, it's the chicken and the egg. So nothing exists like this in our area. So we know that it needs to be there. So the question is getting the audiences there, and then getting the publishers to know that the audiences are there, and so then it's in their interest to put it in, and then it's in the audience's interest to keep checking it out so that publishers know that they're looking. And so it's building that, it's starting that momentum. And once you get that, presumably, we don't know because we're still experimenting with it, but the theory is that it will start to feed into itself, and that people will go there, and publishers will want to be there in order to get their exposure and things like that. So that's the issue that we're working on. We know that tons of people want this information. Some of them, you know, are PR and marketing people. A lot of them are political campaigns. But the demand is there for this, whether you're a journalist or a student. And one other thing I'll say before I pass it on is that once you get a solid database that's not stale, you don't have to just do geographical things. I mean, if you get accurate info that's maintained, you know, you can do. We want to do timelines, so you do a keyword search through all the RSS feeds of everybody on there, and so you know if something happens like a story breaks, you can figure out who's covering it and when they posted it based on the RSS feeds. But it all comes through a mother database that has to be maintained. So
have you created a format yet that's maintainable?
Well, basically, I started mine on a spreadsheet on a Google Doc, just like the folks here have done, and so we have a little bit more money left to convert it to a SQL database, and that's more robust. You can make spreadsheets out of it, and so it's just going to be just like a form and get people in there and do that. But yeah, we'll, stay in touch and we'll let you know how it goes. Yeah.
Could I just add a couple things? I love maps too very much, but maybe just a little bit of caution. First of all, we looked at 1,400 sites to develop our list of promising sites, and that ended up being about 10% of those. And what we found was that there were several major lists, databases out there that sort of were seen as the authoritative list of sites, and they hadn't been updated for a couple of years. So, the maintenance, this has national significance. So the research was based on lists of sites that hadn't been updated for years. So, make sure you mean it if you're going to go there. The other thing I really want to emphasize, though, is given most of us lack the resources to do everything we'd like to do, I think priorities are really important, and I think in some contexts doing mapping makes a lot of sense, but dots on the map are not the kinds of relationships and community partnerships that you need to forge if you're going to be sustainable in this space. I think the relationships with a few very important partners can be a lot more important in many contexts, especially if you're doing media on the ground, than knowing who everybody is. So set your priorities. The other thing I'll reemphasize from what I was talking about earlier is knowing who all the media organizations are and where they sit on the map does not tell you whether people in communities have access to the information they need. So please don't lose sight of that.
we're coming up to the end of time, but Rod,
Rod Benson at New York University. And maybe someone hit on this earlier, but yeah, just to build on that last point, it seems to me that the real, what could be really exciting about this is to map onto this the social demographics of the audiences for each of these media outlets, and then to get a sense of how much you've really covered everybody, or how much a lot of the media actually overlap. And that's difficult. I've tried to do a little bit of this myself more for the New York area and national media, but a lot of the data is proprietary. So for example, newspapers, it's the Audit Bureau of Circulation that Scarborough reports. You can get some good data on that, on education, income, race and ethnicity, gender. You can get a lot of good data that way. Profession as well, occupation. But a lot of media, some newspapers don't participate. So I actually called Scarborough, begged for I think the Murdoch papers. That's how I got that. And then for TV, I was trying to deal with Nielsen, and through months of negotiations, they finally said they would give me the academic rate of $2,500 to get a few basic data points on the national network news audiences. So, but that's I think that's really the kind of valuable information that we need to have.
Hi, my name is Ben Sheldon. I built a map called Mapping Access in 2007 based off of Rob's data in 2000, and sort of all of the things that these people are saying I wanted to echo, that before you start this process is to really figure out what are the principles, what is the reason that you're doing this. There's a certain human element and desire to want to have the most comprehensive, real-time, accurate data for everything in the world. And the fact is that that is an impossible task. And what I found with my thing, Mapping Access, was I took Rob's database of 3,000 access centers from the spreadsheet, put it on a map. And it's like, great, look at all these centers. And then I started getting emails from people that said, hey, they didn't return my call. Hey, I went by their place and nobody was there. And so I went back and said, you know, sort of off of Jacob, of saying, okay, this data is completely useless. There's a very large number, but there's not any, you know, you don't know what data is good or bad. So I got rid of all of that and went to the opposite side of everybody can submit their data. So now I have 345 cable access centers, but I know every single one of those, there is a name and there is an email address affiliated with it of somebody who cares enough about that center or about that area that they took the time to go to my website and put that data in. So those are the relationships that you want to try to be creating, that it's not so much, you know, the latitude and longitude is not what you really want. You want to know that there's somebody, if you pick up the phone or you send an email, that they're going to read it and they're going to respond to it, so that when you actually need to do organizing or do outreach or, you know, do fundraising or whatever, that these are actual real people or real businesses and not just, as people say, points on a map.
Just a really quick point. When we were building Oakland Local in the summer of 2009, we actually mapped the whole ecosystem of blogs in Oakland, discovered there were over 3,000 bloggers. And I just want to underscore, we didn't think about maintaining it. So I now have a database, if it's 2 years old, that people want to be added to, that's not really core enough to my mission to maintain it. So, you know, what I learned is, like, don't create SQL databases or spreadsheets. We don't have a strategy to keep updating it. So, you know, it was a good idea, but we didn't actually execute it well.
So it's 5:30. We're coming to the end now. Just calling the panelists for final comment, if you have particular final comments. No, Rob, you didn't able to get in.
Just to respond to Tom's, thanks. To respond to something Tom asked earlier, Tom Clammer, we got your email, and we've been having a little colloquy over email as to how we might be able to address to bring these resources to help you. But specifically on that, Well, and from the data that I have in here, and Ben's quite right, some of it is, just a hint of a reference on a community's, on a government's website. There's an access channel there, and they don't give you a name or anything. But yeah, we can show you the data that's in here, and we can map it. But more important to the point Michelle was making about building relationships. At the moment, the CiviCRM is just a data collection tool, but it allows the ability to do, for its members, its participating members, to do e-blast and correspondence. So a tool such as this, whether it's this one or some other one, would be a way for organizations, communities, to find each other participants of like mind in their communities and start conversations. So it's not just a pretty picture. It's hopefully a way in which relationships can start being built.
And with that, I will call the session to an end. Thank you all for coming. I'd like you to put your hands together for the panelists here, who've done a great job. And if there are any left over, the info toolkit, there might be a few left on the ground, is a very good place to start.
Yeah, it was nice. I've loved it.